Welcome back to Previously Prohibited. I'm Jenin Eunice here with my co-host Melissa Whitty, and we're joined today by GenXGirl. Her Twitter handle is at GenXGirl1994. She's remaining anonymous, so she won't be on camera today, but she'll be sharing her insights verbally. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Anti-Defamation League's latest report on anti-Semitism and why it really doesn't reflect the reality of anti-Semitism in America. But first, Mel, over to you.
Yeah, guys, welcome back. Thank you so much. If you could, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and leave us a comment. We read all of your comments. We're so grateful for them, even the mean ones sometimes, because sometimes they make us laugh. So we're so happy to have you with us. I'm just going to call you Jen.
Yes,
and
perfect.
yeah, so you put out so much great data. You really take your time, you compile it all, you put it into, you make your own graphics that you share online. And yeah, you have been, in my opinion, super instrumental in helping to get a lot of this data and the hard numbers out there for people to consume in a way that they can consume them, right? They can understand them, like how this stuff is being manipulated. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I've been on X for a couple years, and I mainly post on anti-war, free speech, and government corruption. Those are probably what I write about all the time. Since October 7th, I have focused a lot. I know that for like the first 6 to 8 months, everyone was just like devastated with all the images and things like that everyone was seeing. But I started to notice a pattern of, the narrative, and I knew about, the Israel lobby, for years now, but I started to see it really in action, and I started to see how it was completely, discombobulated from what was happening, in with people, with the larger masses. Everyone was reacting one way, Congress was reacting the opposite. And then and that's what really got me to start digging. Like something is off here. And then I remember hearing, I think that congressional aides, and also White House aides were also, it was like a big clue for me, because they started, I don't know if you guys remember, but they had like this 100 people, congressional aid like rally in Congress, where they all like walked out of Congress, and they were like, they had like a press briefing saying, Congress is not listening to its constituents. Absolutely, our phone lines are, blowing up. They don't care. And it was just very like, I knew that there was a disconnect, but I had no idea it was this bad. And I was like, something's got to be there. So that's where I got to start digging into the ADLs and the APACs and Israel lobbies and all that stuff. And that kind of got me to here. But ADL is one of my pet projects, because they never cease to stop giving. There's just
Right.
plenty of data.
Yeah, so
Can
so
you?
you're saying that I actually don't know about a walkout. Do you remember that, Janine? I don't remember that.
I don't think so. Yeah, I
Yeah,
checked out early on. I
right.
was pretty pregnant, and I was like, I want to focus on the baby, and I've suffered so much
Mm-hmm.
agony in my life over the
Yeah.
Palestine-Israel conflict, and knowing a lot of Zionists, I like cannot deal with this right now. So I didn't.
Yeah.
I sort of tried to ignore things for a while.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but you're so right, Jen, in that there was I mean, and to this day, there's such a strong disconnect between what the public, even if, and I don't expect, obviously, all of Congress to somehow, turn and be, against Israel, but the fact that, like, none of them, like, you had no one, even people like Rashida Tlaib, she was still kind of timid with her criticisms. It wasn't like she was tweeting every day. I mean, you've got Elise Stefanik, who has quite literally for 500 and something days now tweeted every single day
Yeah.
about
Hmm.
October 7th.
I mean,
And probably Rashida Tlaib has maybe made maybe 10 posts, probably.
Well, if you guys
I mean,
remember early on, they censured her for even
yeah,
having the audacity to stand up for the Palestinians. Um,
yeah,
so it was pretty bad, but it was interesting, because when I started to look, that incident happened around November. It was November,
Okay.
December where the walkout happened. And I started to look into legislation. And it's so funny, and it's a project that I've been meaning to work on. But I've been tracking this from that time, from December of 2023. Do you know that they started out passing non-binding resolutions, redefining things in the House? It never even, it was just a House resolution. It was non-binding. It was just one of those, the ones that like Thomas Massey talks about, the nice, we're going to recognize this, but it means absolutely nothing. Well, it doesn't absolutely mean nothing, because what happens is those resolutions, then the Israel lobby cites them in their reporting, and they
Right.
cite them as if it's law, and they're not law,
Mm,
right? It's
yeah.
absolutely, it's like house rules, that's it. But
Mhm.
they started to redefine things from river to the sea, defining things like anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It was like literally a series of House resolutions.
Right.
Once they
Yeah.
built enough of those, and I think that I was tracking like something like 7 or 8, once they built enough of those, then they started moving on to actual bills. So this has been a
Okay.
slow progression, that they've built and conditioned people.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you said that, because I'm thinking about this resolution out of San Marcos, Texas. And I was kind of harping on that earlier. So you had, for those that don't know, San Marcos is the home of Texas State. It's a little bit of a liberal town, and their city council has a vote to adopt a resolution calling for the reallocation of tax dollars that are from San Marcos to stop them from going to Israel, and then and then reinvesting them into domestic priorities. And they announced it, and they're supposed to have a vote on it, I guess, sometime later this month. And Greg Abbott said if they passed that resolution, which again is just a resolution, it's non-binding, and I don't know if it's quite the same situation, but I kept saying like, it's not like they're passing a law. They're not going to be able to stop their money going from Israel. They're just saying this is what we think should happen. And Greg Abbott said if they did that, that he would do everything he could to pull all of their grant funding from the state, which is
Yeah.
just nuts, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's interesting that maybe that is why they freaked out so bad about, essentially a non-binding resolution. They just they don't want the precedent even getting set that you could even talk about these things, you know?
That's absolutely true. And Thomas Massey again has, I quote him often because he's, probably one of the only people who actually openly talks about it. But, it's just that. It's exactly what you said. What I've noticed is they don't want to even give an inch, because that means that now there's like a slight, the door is slightly ajar, and that
Mhm.
can't happen. So they just will swoop in and pressure and shut it down.
Yeah.
Right,
And I
exactly.
think I think they did a lot of that stuff in Congress early on when it was so, I mean, I didn't speak out for the reason I mentioned earlier very much. I wrote a post on October 8th or 9th and said, as someone who has both like Jewish parent and a Palestinian parent, I can tell you, and I've been following this issue closely throughout my life, I can guarantee that like more violence is not going to help anyone. But it was pretty tepid considering what was going on. But I think people were so afraid. Like, the last thing I was going to do was like start taking on bills in Congress about anti-Semitism.
Right.
I didn't, I wasn't willing to even start getting in there till like a year ago, because that's, then you're like, well, I don't want to be seen as someone who's like enabling anti-Semitism, even though we know what's happening, which is that they're conflating anti-Zionism or pro-Palestinian advocacy with anti-Semitism and then stifling it. And so it's very insidious, but I think they're very clever, and they know that like this
Mm-hmm.
people are scared of taking this on.
Yeah.
And it's done exactly, and it's done very gradually, so that it becomes almost like, they'll pass one thing, they wait a few months, let it normalize, and then what you see is this, there's this behavior, this pattern I always see. So the bill will pass, or the resolution will pass, and then the, Israel lobbyists, the talking, mouthpieces, the media that's affiliated with Israel, they will all start talking about it. They will use those same talking points and use
Yeah.
those words, and then it becomes normal. Then two
Yeah.
months later, then we're moving the goalpost a little bit further. You know what I mean? So it just keeps happening like that.
Right. Yeah. Something that really frustrated me very early on was the "from the river to the sea" discourse, because it was so
Yeah.
stupid to me,
Yeah.
so unbelievably stupid. Such a clearly calculated mistranslation. Not even mistranslation. It was a total manipulation of the meaning, and then to the point where reasonable people that I know in real life were like, "Well, are you sure that's not what they mean?" I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
it's so dumb.
Yeah.
Like it's a self-evident what it means.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
you have to twist yourself into a mental pretzel to think that this is a call to genocide.
Genocide. Yeah.
It's ridiculous. You know.
Well, it's
Uh,
it's groupthink, you know, and that's what
yeah.
they utilize here. It's groupthink, right? So no one, you know, just like all of us after October 7th, were very. I know I was very skittish about. Oh, I got to be careful. I don't want to be labeled anti-Semite and blah blah blah.
Right.
That's groupthink, right? Like you don't want to be
Yeah.
labeled and be the outcast, right? And so the same thing here. They start conditioning people to believe certain things, and I mean, it just the list is so long now, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh,
Well,
so
it's
I know
not.
I was.
It's also not just not wanting to be an outcast. Like, I mean, I think people are afraid of real professional consequences, which was certainly a
Yes.
huge part of my. I was just, I thought that I would be fired immediately if I said anything critical, and certainly if I started to take on the anti-Semitism issue. I've been positively surprised by my employers. They don't agree with me, but they've
Yeah.
stood by my right to say what I say on these subjects, despite the complaints they have to deal with.
Right,
Yeah.
right, which is
Yeah.
great. I'm glad.
Absolutely, yeah. And so, which is, I don't know. I feel like Jenin is so kind of even handed with her criticism. You know, she never flies off the rail, never says anything crazy. Whereas I have seen others say absolutely batshit insane things, and I don't know of any of them suffering any consequences career wise.
Did
But
I
that's another
show?
subject. Just had to get that in there.
Yeah, no, you know, it is another subject. We'll talk about it another time. should we talk about the
So, but the
ADL?
data, yes,
Yeah.
the data. So I
So
looked at the data. I started
Wait, should
when
we
I
say
first looked.
should we say what the
I'm
report said first? Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
No,
I'm gonna
just
pull
to,
it
yeah,
up.
sort of lay the
Okay.
groundwork. So the report claimed that, like, what was it? Just basically that there's constant, you know, incessant anti-Semitic acts in this country all the time. What, I forgot what the numbers
Right.
were.
So here we go. This is when they adopted the IHR. So 2016, the ADL adopts the International Holocaust Remembrance. Is that what it is?
Alliance,
Yeah.
yeah, international
Alliance,
definition, which
So
includes
they adopted that definition.
which includes, so it's considered anti-Semitic to criticize Israel, to
Well,
like compare. There are various
technically-
forms of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Technically, it's like if you hold Israel to a higher standard than you would another Western nation. If you call them Nazis, if you compare them unfavorably to Nazis, if you, it's like a whole.
Well,
list.
also, I think it's
Technically-
also like denying the right of Jews to their homeland, which I think suggests call like
Right.
anti-Zionist viewpoints. And part of the issue with people who are concerned about speech and censorship is that these are also kind of vague notions. So what happens is people are like, well, I don't know. So maybe if I say I think Palestinians should have equal rights, maybe that means that I'm anti-Semitic. So I'm just going to shut up. And that's called a chilling effect. So I think because a lot of these terms are
Right.
vague, it's also worth noting that the person who wrote the IHRA definition, he has said it wasn't supposed to be used as like for law enforcement purposes or anything like that. It was like, these could be indicia depending on the context of anti-Semitism. I mean, I don't really even
Right.
agree with him on that, but like, you know, someone who incessantly talks about Israel but never talks about Sudan, which they always say, but like the reason we incessantly talk about Israel and not Sudan is because our government is funding what Israel does and enabling it, but we don't do that with Sudan. So it's all very silly, but in any event,
Yeah,
this was never meant to be like, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I actually believe that they use the word fluid in the actual definition, that it's a fluid definition. It can mean many
Yeah.
things that, different things at different times, which should obviously be the a big red flag for most people about
Yeah.
this is an easily manipulated concept.
Gotcha.
So anyways, sorry, Jen, didn't mean to cut you
Yeah.
off there, but So
Oh, no,
so
no,
they had,
no. So,
yeah.
and they also, in that definition, just to round that off, they also at the bottom of that list of 11 have this little disclaimer that says that these are just recommendations. These are non-binding,
Mm-hmm.
this is a non-binding agreement or whatever it's called. But then it says in italics, unless it's incorporated into law, right?
Hmm.
And so that's the part when they sell it, they leave out, right? And so a lot of people, in the last year that I would have these discussions with, they would say, well, but it's non-binding. I'm like, yes, but it's not binding if it's just standalone. But if your government is incorporating it into law, it's going to become binding. Like, I don't
Right.
understand why people don't get
Yeah.
that. So
Right.
that was the selling point for them. But on the data, so I looked at the 2023 data first, and that's how I got into this. So of course, when the 2024 came out, I was all over it. But so this is a trend, and that I found on this data, and I noticed that because they use the IHRA, there's a lot of squishy, incidents and definitions being used and what they include. What was most important for me was that in 2023, the Jewish Currents audited ADL's data. And their audit report was, I mean, just a complete destruction of ADL's report. They concluded that 44% of their data was not anti Semitism. This is 2023's data.
Mm-hmm.
Um, 36% was straight out. They threw it out because they don't use the IHRA. They use a different definition that's been around for decades. They said those are all, protests and anti-Israel, speech. There was another set of like 8% that was just flat out unverifiable. It was
Mm-hmm.
ADL entering, things like anti-Semitism incident happened on April, whatever, and that was it. So that, that got me, started, and I started to push that out like, hey, people need to pay attention to this. But 2024's data was even more incredible because they came out pushing this as, oh my gosh, there's an explosion of anti-Semitism happening. And look at this chart. So if Mel, if you could actually scroll it down a little bit so we can
Uh-huh.
look at the bar graph.
Oh, that one right there.
Yeah, the bar graph.
Okay, there
Yeah.
you go. Yep.
I color coded it, but on ADLs, all you see is one color. So what you see is 23 is exploding, 24 is even higher. And there's, it's an epidemic and it's, everyone's going crazy being
Right.
anti-Semitic.
So
But if
right
you,
here is when it's adopted, is the IHRA, right?
in 2016,
Oh,
yeah,
2016. Okay, okay. All right. So
2016,
there,
yeah.
okay, yeah, so it does, yeah, and then, okay.
Yeah. So when you see the little red, the red is all of the entries from the ADL's report themselves each year where they're including anti-Israel and anti-Zionism as part of their report. Now, mind you, majority of these entries, like by a vast majority, are in their segment that's called harassment. And if you read the definition of that, it's that's where it gets very loose and very squishy, right? Because these are not
Right.
crimes, these are verbal altercations, these are now protests. This
Mm-hmm.
is someone standing across from a Jewish institution, or in the case of, if you remember last year, the protests that were happening outside of the synagogues because of the illegal real estate
Land
events.
auctions. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
those are included, so because per civil rights law, religious institutions are protected, and so they'll include that immediately. It doesn't matter what's going on. If it happens outside, they include all of those. So anyhow, you see
Gotcha.
this slow progression of them adding it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Slowly and slowly. Well, in 23 they changed their definition even more and made it much more all encompassing, which is why you see this explosion of
Yeah.
data that they were
Yeah.
collecting.
Yeah.
And that carried into 24.
Yeah.
Except in 24's data is really interesting because when you remove the anti-Israel, anti-Zionism entries, which I believe was like 74% of the report, it
Mm-hmm.
actually goes down from 23.
Okay,
Wow.
yeah, it does, doesn't it? Yeah, it's
Yeah.
yeah, kind of actually a lot. It goes down about what 1,500, yeah, or
Yeah.
1,400, yeah.
Did
Yeah.
did you
But
get a sense from what you the data you had as to what like so something that actually would fall into anti-Semitic incidents, what kind of stuff, were there sort of things that you saw more or types of, I'm sort of
so
curious what, yeah.
yeah, what type? So they'll include
Yeah.
examples that they'll cite in their paragraph. Up until I think it was the 2019 or 2020, they actually used to have a link where they would upload a sample of their list. They
Mm-hmm.
stopped doing that altogether. So you don't even see
Interesting.
a sample anymore.
Yeah.
What you see are quotes. So things like Israel, the Israel
Mm-hmm.
is a Zionist, Israel is a committing genocide. Israel is an
Right.
apartheid state. You know what I mean? And this
Yeah.
is literally defined on the ADL site as anti-Israel. It used to be called anti-Israel animus, but now they've just made it straight anti-Semitic.
Anti-Semitic, yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So again, another progression, right? It took a
Yeah.
Yeah.
few years and now we're here. What was
Yeah.
interesting also was that they the section that was designated for white supremacy,
Mm-hmm.
that also includes anti-Zionism information. So
Mm.
I was curious because I was like, in my mind, I always just kind of associated with, maybe there's protest or some sort of attack or, I don't know. I just had this
Mm-hmm.
like idea.
Mm-hmm.
So I started like digging in there. And what they also include are things like, and it's for 24, they actually called it white supremacy propaganda is what they labeled that section.
Yeah.
And 80 something percent, I think it's either 70 or 80% of it, it's in my thread, um is
I can pull it up. Yeah.
is are phrases like Zionist occupied government, Zionists are, references to the Israel lobby, things like that, which
Okay. Okay.
also is very squishy, you know what I mean? Because it's like, well,
Yeah.
I don't have examples. You're just telling me what it is. So I'm kind of curious to see what this is, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's also that. And then
Okay, here's yeah, more broadly, anti-Israel animus manifested in various ways during the 2021-2022 academic year, including accusing Israel of committing genocide or ethnic cleansing, settler colonial state or apartheid state, calling for BDS against Israel. Well, that is
Wow.
quite. That's. I mean, I'm actually shocked that the numbers aren't bigger than what they are. If we're throwing all that in there, yeah, that's pretty broad. Essentially, so they always say,
it's
well, you
very
can criticize Israel, you just can't be anti-Semitic, and it's like, well,
Yeah.
actually, apparently, there's almost nothing that you can do
well,
that.
and the data really, like, it validates that, it almost seems like they had opened that door, but they were being careful. In
Right.
23 they just, threw everything out and just it was just like a wide dragnet, and everything and anything bring it in, right?
Yeah.
um and it was just a complete cluster because, I mean, you guys have to look at and there's a link in there, and if you guys ever get a chance, read the Jewish
Yeah.
Currents audit. It's an
Yeah.
amazing audit to read because you see a lot of they give a lot of examples.
Yeah.
um they what was also funny, and this is kind of a side note, is they actually also cited that they included under their assault report for 23, they actually included a Palestinian getting assaulted under the anti-Semitism report. And so
Wow.
they called that out. They were like, what is what is this? So um But one final thing that I wanted to note about that data is also going back to 2017. I don't know if you guys have heard of this incident, but there was a Israeli who was living in Israel
Yeah.
who had made who was making threats
Here.
against.
Yeah, I'll pull it up again real quick. Yeah, because that's a good one. Yeah, so right here,
Yeah, the
2017.
green. Yep, 150
50
incidents. So
bomb threats?
Yeah.
yes, bomb
And it was
threats.
this guy in Israel doing it.
Yeah, like bomb threats, making he would particularly target community centers with children and call
Mm-hmm.
and say horrible things about what he was going to do to the kids, and it caused like mass, panic. And so they found him and he was in Israel and he was doing this and he's Jewish. And so, any other demographic that I see, if it's like, that demographic, attacking their own, I typically have
Right.
not seen it being included as racism because
Right.
you're part of that community. But
Well,
in this
and
Right.
case,
isn't
they included
and
that.
I mean, I'm just speculating, but I assume typically the purpose of these events is to give the impression that there's a lot of anti-Semitism, which is kind of the justification for Israel, right? Like Jews aren't safe in
Right.
America because there's so much anti-Semitism, so we need Israel, and even if that means killing a lot of people to keep our precious ethno-state. So I mean, and I think that's one of the reasons it's important to kind of try to show that this narrative that this country is just rife with anti-Semitism is not true, because for
Right.
one, it's this rampant anti-Semitism that's been used as the justification for shredding the First Amendment, and two, it's the justification for what's being done to the Palestinians. Like, if Israel doesn't have its ethno-state, then they can never be safe, and so that justifies sort of
Right.
putting aside our normal requirements, for a country, for considering a country an ally, like
Right.
that they treat everybody equally, not based on religion or ethnicity.
Yeah.
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. I was just going to agree with her, and I also found it ironic because if the argument is that for that Israel is the only safe place for Jewish people, here's a guy in Israel making 150 death threats against Jewish people in
Yeah.
America, like you know what I
Right.
mean? So it's just kind of
Right.
like, come on, yeah.
Was
Yeah.
that ever exposed? Like the purpose was he just like mentally ill, or was he trying to
His
as I
mom said.
said, uh,
Yeah, so he got convicted by the FBI, or sorry, he got charged by the FBI. I'm not sure. He was in Israel and he was in custody there, so I'm not sure what happened to him. But his mom, I read a report that his mom said that he was mentally ill. He was 18. He was very
uh,
young, so I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah.
so we don't know if the
But
motivation was to try to create the appearance of anti-Semitism, or he just was mentally ill and there was no real reason.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
yeah, and that's obviously I'd we always feel like we have to say this, but I do think it's actually is important. It's not like anti-Semitism doesn't exist. It's
Right.
interesting. Just the other day, maybe about like a month ago, I got into a tiff with Laura Loomer, and I was like shocked at how many people came into the comments, like, and they didn't follow me, so I don't even, and maybe they followed her, but to just like hurl anti-Semitic like insults at her, it was
Mhm.
like dozens. And again, this had nothing to do with, it was just me and her spatting with each other. It wasn't anything having to do with Israel or anything like that. She accused me, of course, of like some kind of always thinking everything had to be a Jewish conspiracy, which was really weird because I wasn't talking about Jews or Israel or anything like that at all. I was talking about right-wing grifting influencers. But yeah, so I actually kind of felt a little bad for her, considering
Yeah.
how intense it was. It was so many of them, and it was just really vile stuff. So it's not like this stuff doesn't happen, but then when you cheapen that accusation to the point where it's
Yeah.
like, oh, if you say Israel's the settler colonial project, or which I actually don't even believe. I think colonialism is obviously it's got a definition. It's very different. I think it's an apartheid state, certainly, and I don't actually even think that you could make a good case that it's not an apartheid state. But if you're going to say that that's an act of anti-Semitism, well, then you just water down everything else.
Yeah, I think then you open the door to question, everything, right? So like that 2023 audit, and I think that it was got a blessing for ADL that it didn't get more airtime, but
Hmm.
that is a really damning report, and it really does, create a situation where you question the rest of the data, particularly since none of us have access to the rest of the data.
Right.
Yeah, and
And
so.
also, it's important to note how powerful the ADL actually is. This is not just some, regular old advocacy group. This is a group that their programs that they design and implement, the ADL trains the FBI,
Mm-hmm.
which is crazy if you think about the fact that if these are the guidelines they're using to train federal agents, yeah, there should be a really, number one, a very strict definition as to what you quantify as anti-Semitism. It should be published, and I think that they're to me, it should definitely be something you can pin down very specifically because, as we've seen now very recently up in Michigan, if you've got federal agents kicking in your door over claims of
Mm-hmm.
anti Semitism, it
Yeah.
better damn well be for something more than criticism of a foreign country. All
Well,
right.
I
I
think,
don't
Right.
care
and I
how
think
much criticism it is.
I think the other
Exactly.
really galling thing is that and sorry if you guys don't want to be associated with these statements. I'm only speaking for myself, not the other two people. But the only people that I'm aware of who have been seriously physically injured, sort of in relation to hatred over the October 7th issue, have been Palestinians. There was the little boy who was stabbed to death, his mom who was stabbed to death, who were Palestinians. 3 Palestinian students shot in Vermont. And, as someone of Palestinian descent, it kind of infuriates me that there's all this anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism. No one's talking about anti-Palestinian bigotry, even though there have been no Jewish people in this country seriously injured. To my knowledge, it's possible I don't know about something.
Well, there was one out in LA, and it was a scuffle, and
Yeah, he
unfortunately,
was
it was an
like
old
pushed
man.
over to
Yeah.
protest, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and he hit
Yeah.
his head. So
But
certainly
that
don't want
also
to.
wasn't, I mean, I don't know exactly what happened, but to my knowledge, that wasn't necessarily like someone going up and being like, you're Jewish. It was more of a like spat that occurred over being on
Well, it was
opposite
two
sides of the
groups that
protest.
were like fighting each other. Yeah,
Yeah.
they were crazy. So, but
Mm-hmm.
of course, people would say that that's one group. But the case with the little boy was really sad because
Horrible.
apparently, obviously that man was mentally ill because they said that
Mm-hmm.
the little boy. He had built the little boy and I'm sorry, I don't know
Treehouse.
his name, and
A
I keep
tree house.
he had
I
built him a
think
tree house,
Wadi.
and yeah, and that he had ran up to the man and gave him a hug when he came in, and then the guy just started stabbing him. I mean, that
Stabbing
was like
him.
such a heartbreaking case. But yeah, people, again, I think it's not necessarily anti Palestinian. Yes, it is, but it's really the anti Muslim rhetoric that is allowed to be spewed across. Uh, all mainstream media. It's insane how much is allowed to go out
And
there.
often by the same people complaining about anti-Semitism. And like when
Yeah.
they define anti-Semitism as criticism of Israel. It's so galling.
Right. And so just whipping people up into a frenzy, and you can see it all the time, but we saw it definitely after October 7th, very prominent. And so yeah, that was such a sad case.
And
But
even
again,
and even that the conflating of anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian, right,
mhm,
sentiment is something that actually and was created by the ADL and by
mhm.
surprise Benjamin Netanyahu was the first to introduce these concepts in the 80s and when he came to brief Congress. And it's incredible, and the motivation was to create anti-Palestinian, sentiment in America. But because most Palestinians are Muslim, they're not all Muslim. That it had to also be anti-Muslim, and so it grew. It started out from there, and then over time, it grew, to what it is today.
Right.
Um, and so, yeah, so I mean, if you go, a lot of this stuff, every time I trace back, I'm like, oh my God, I don't even know why I trace back. I should just be like, I already know where it's going to end up, But a lot of this is like that. But one more thing that you mentioned earlier about the FBI, ADL training the FBI. I don't know if you guys saw. I think it was in the last 2 weeks, there's an executive order that Trump just signed requiring the police departments throughout the U.S. to report to the FBI hate crime repository. Um, I've looked into that repository. I know that statistically, 90% of the country does report
Mm-hmm.
into that repository. So they want to get it to 100%, which I think is great, you know? But here's the catch. If you look at the executive order, there's penalties now. So if you are in, I don't know, I don't even know, if there are areas like this, but let's just pick Wyoming, someplace where you're not going to have a big, wide, heterogeneous population, and you're not going to have a lot of hate crime, right? I,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know this to be a fact, but I'm just giving an example. They are requiring that every police department should be reporting hate crime because the premise is hate crime exists all the time. Okay.
Gotcha.
And so it
Yeah,
needs to get reported. And if you don't
gotcha.
report it, and they're establishing quotas for how much you have to get. There's like a target you have to hit. If you don't, then you lose your funding, your federal
Oh,
funding.
so that
Yeah.
Yeah.
incentivizes
Wow.
reporting more hate crimes,
Yes.
obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And
That's
then here's the
bad.
other catch.
That's really
So
bad.
that's
Yeah,
very
that's
bad.
really bad.
That's really
Really
bad.
bad.
Right? And so okay, so you lose your funding, but you can get your funding back if you agree to have your whole police department go through training.
Wow.
What do you guys want to bet who's going to be doing the training?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
ADL.
Yep.
Maybe Baytar.
Guaranteed they
Baytar
will.
doing the training.
Yeah, but this is horrible because, I mean, I will say that, for the last 4 years, I've seen the conservative right fight the DEI initiative. What is this, if not that?
Yes.
Right. It's a bunch of frauds, is what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean,
It's
what they've
interesting
been.
that you used Wyoming because that's the case with Matthew Shepard. And I never knew the real story about the Matt Shepard story, which is the official story was he was the gay kid that got kidnapped and then
Yep.
tied and to the gate and left out there to die, right? Except I read a book recently about that story, and it is actually totally different than everything that we were fed. And it's a sad story in and of itself, and it is a tragedy, certainly, but it was not this rabid anti-gay hate crime. And
Oh.
yeah, I know. I didn't know
I didn't know
that.
that. I didn't
It was
know that.
actually
had read
mostly a
that.
drug deal gone bad.
Yeah.
It was what gone bad?
Mostly a drug deal gone bad.
Really?
Yeah, and so, but we see the way in which that crime was used and manipulated and sold to the American public to push forward all of these like gay rights and gay protections. And I'm not saying that that stuff is bad. I know that gay people are targeted a lot. I certainly think that that's abhorrent if you do that, but it was definitely sold to us under a false story.
Yeah.
And there are implications for a lot of that stuff. So yeah, it's the Book of Matt is the name of the book. If anybody
I'm
wants to
sort
know
of-
that story.
I always think whenever we make policies out of specific tragedies, regardless of what the actual story is, it's a bad idea.
Mhm.
Like, because what happens
agree.
is then
Yeah.
these are very emotionally driven. They're not sort of evidence-based.
Mhm.
They're not rational. So whenever I see something that's like, Kylie's Law or this or that, I'm like, oh no, that's that's going to be bad
Yeah.
because, it's, and not to say, like, of course it's horrible when terrible things happen to people. I'm not like, of course I have
Right.
compassion for that, but like, it's not a good way to make law. And I think as a society that, we should reconsider that instinct.
Well, also that number one, yeah, that we definitely shouldn't let our emotions drive our government policy. But also in the age of like mass media, mass communications, you're able to blow up what should just be a local news story, local crime story,
Right.
and then you'll see the manipulation and apply it across the board to a nation of 330 million people, which is not practical, and obviously has a lot of consequences, especially in terms of government overreach. So the same Republicans who are always crying about the federal government and Big Brother and all of this stuff. Now, what we saw after October 7th was all of a sudden they love some big government. They love censorship. They love everything they claimed that they hated. And that's been a really tough pill to swallow. I think for anyone, obviously I've been on the right pretty much my whole life, but even like Jenin, who kind of came over after COVID, that's been very difficult to watch because everybody's a bunch of frauds.
Yeah, no, I agree with you both on that. And you see that in the case of, like, for example, using situations to get money, right? To profit from, or to get funding for your pet project or whatever. Going back to the ADL, they use their data that they generate to then submit budget requests to the federal government. This blew my mind. My career has always been in or around the federal government. And I know the procurement process really well. And one of the big no-nos is that if you are benefiting, or if your partner agency, or group is benefiting from a program that you're advocating for, you can't compete for that, or you can't be the recipient of that. In this case, $1.2 billion for the 20, I believe it was for the 2024 fiscal year, was submitted by the ADL for their pet projects. I mean, this was everything from, mind you, there's supposed to be a civil liberty org, right? But they're advocating for State Department to do PR campaigns for the Abraham Accord. I mean, it's all over the place. It's
Wow.
like, I don't understand how that has anything to do with a civil liberty organization. But okay, there's little line items. And I had posted about that because I was like, this is incredible. But what's really interesting is that the recipient of some of that money, or a big chunk of it, at least like 500 something million dollars of it, are these organizations that they're partnered with that feed ADL their anti-Semitism data. One of which is the Secure Community Network. They claim they're all over the United States, and they are the security, a service provider for Jewish community centers and synagogues. And they're also the people who collect incident reports. And then ADL on their site says that they get their data from the Secure Community Network. Well, Security Community Network is funded through DHS's secure grant program that ADL put in a budget request for.
So it's a giant circle jerk.
Big time. Oh my God, big time. It's insane. So
wow. Yeah. And then I know the other big one is the security grants for religious institutions. I remember being pretty floored when I found out, and that budget I think went over $1 billion after October 7th. But basically what it is, to people who don't know, that the HHS has a program for religious institutions that they can apply for grants up to, I believe it's $200,000 for added security if they face threats and whatnot. And any religious institution can apply for it, right? And so it's meant for like paying security guards and upgrading security systems, cameras, things like that, and then maintenance of those. And of any religious institution in the country can apply for it. Obviously, we have a huge country, kind of a small Jewish population, and I believe it's 80% of all of those funds go to Jewish organizations.
Well, Mel, that's exactly the program, the Secure Community Network that I was talking about.
Okay.
Yeah. So what they do is they have, and they're not the only ones. There's the multiple, but they're one of the big ones. You know how they get so many Jewish institutions to get, to get money? They have, if you look up on YouTube, Secure Community Network, you'll get their page. Their entire page is dedicated to training sessions for the Jewish community on how to apply to
Grant writing.
DHS so
Yeah.
that you get approved. They literally have sessions, so they have a whole little, process set up so that
Right.
all of this money gets funneled, and then it goes to them. They collect data that is, all over, uh,
Yeah.
clearly like 50 something percent of it is not anti-Semitism, and then they feed it back to ADL. So it's just a big feeding loop.
Right. Yeah. And I'm just not a fan of doing this. I think it's mostly really, really unnecessary for any religious institution. There's just not that many threats in this country. You don't, when it happens, it's such a big deal. It's so rare that it's such a big deal that you do hear about it. So I don't know. I think the last time I checked, the budget was like $1.3 billion. I feel like there's a lot of better ways to spend that money in this country than on, if you have to send a police car over, if we have to, up the police details, certainly we should, but that should definitely be tied to specific threats within each one's community, not just this kind of blank check that's written to these organizations every year, $200,000.
Maybe we should tell Doge about it.
Oh, I remember people tagging Doge in a lot of this stuff. Yeah, I mean, we all know there's so much waste that could be cut from our government, but everybody's got their little pet projects, and so that's why.
Well, and then also when you're redefining things to fit that narrative, then it just becomes, it's just like a runaway train, right? So, even though if you compare FBI's data, for example, on hate crime to ADL's data, it's complete shock, right? Because it's like a fraction. But if you're redefining things and you're telling people that saying, Israel is an apartheid state is an anti-Semitic, attack, then now you've got this, 9,000 whatever incident report that you can then use to ask for more money.
Right. Yeah. So it's I know it's fascinating. It's such a we could probably spend hours just on this. In fact, I know that we can, because I have been writing a APAC thread for about 3 months now, and I have got a folder that's probably got 4 or 5 gigs worth of crap in it.
Wow.
It's really wild how tangled the webs are, but we do have to go. And we will definitely have you back here soon, Jen.
Yeah.
If you do not follow Jen, go follow her. She's fantastic. Her information is so abundant, and she has so much. Every time I think you can't, I actually feel like a loser because you get so many good threads out with all these graphics and everything. And I'm like, I'm still writing this thing I started 3 weeks ago. So
thank you so much for joining us.
And
we will have to have you back. Bye.
Yes. So bye, guys.
Bye.